This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Noodler's 54th Massachusetts. I'm going to test it in a variety of pens and nibs, nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. And I've got my Pilot Metropolitan setting out here. It's got a cursive medium nib because it was my favorite pen and nib to use with this ink in the writing samples that I've done so far, and I'll talk about that when we get to the writing sample here. I'm going to start with my Pilot Extra Fine. Now this is I think this is sometimes called a blue-black, but it's a really pale blue-black. It's more of a blue-gray, and typically in the past I haven't really liked this shade of ink, but then I started thinking of it as a denim color, and when I think of it as like a pair of well-worn pair of blue jeans, it makes me like it more. Alright, so this is now this is kind of surprising. This is a Pilot 78G Plus with an extra fine. On this Tomoe River paper, this extra fine actually feels nice. On the other papers that I've used it on so far, it was less pleasant, but yeah, this is nice. Absolutely no scratchiness to it, and you know, if you like fine nibs, I think you would find that pretty pleasant. But like I said, that's just on this Tomoe River paper. Alright, next I have another 78G Plus. This one has a fine nib. And it looks like on the other papers that I've tested it on, it looks wider than I was expecting. And that is one of the characteristics of this ink. It does tend to spread. But this one also feels nice. And like I mentioned, this looks like a blue jean color. I like to use my pens and inks in pairs. I like to pair up ink colors that look good together. And when I think of this as the color of blue jeans, I don't know, just mentally I'm able to pair it with more inks because like blue jeans go with everything. This is a Pilot 78G. It's not a G+, which that really doesn't make any difference for the nib. These use the same nibs. But this one's a medium. And this is very smooth. And it's not very wet. Let me see if I got a good... Yeah, it's less wet than the fine nib was. And I think part of that is this ink does soak in really quickly, and this medium nib will spread it out and allow it to soak in. So I don't think it's actually that much. This pen's not really putting down less ink. It's just spreading it out over a wider area. But that's really smooth. Next, I've got my Kaweco Perkeo all black with a medium nib. It's really smooth, but I think because this nib has that black coating, it has just a little bit of feedback to it. I find that very pleasant. All right. And finally, or not finally, but my favorite pen to use with this ink, my Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. Very smooth. And this is an understated pen. It's an understated work ink. This would be good to use in like at a meeting or something where you're not wanting to draw attention to yourself, but you want an ink that's going to work on a variety of paper qualities. And you can see it's not a very wet writer. But again, kind of like I mentioned with the medium nib up here, this cursive medium nib spreads the ink out, so it does allow it to soak into the paper quicker. All right, now, finally, the 1.5 stub nib in my Jinhao X750. It's very satisfying to write with, but the end results I'm not as crazy about. And I'll talk about why. It has to do with the way it soaks into the paper and tends to spread out. All right, I'm going to let that dry while I take a look at some other writing samples. I've got my Rhodia paper, and in the extra fine, it wasn't scratchy, but it wasn't as enjoyable as the Tomoe River paper. Everything else was nice and pleasant. Now, I did mention that this ink tends to spread out. It's not terrible like some inks, but out of all of these, I just preferred the Pilot Metropolitan. You got less of that sensation of it being an ink that spreads out. In the stub nib, it's just a flat, kind of grainy looking, nothing exceptional. And one thing, I wanted to compare it to the Sailor Manyo Kikyu, which I also consider kind of a work ink. It's that dark blue, and it has a little more brightness to it. Let me see. And it doesn't soak into the paper as quickly. So you can see it's kind of a little bit brighter blue. This is more along the lines of Oxford blue, the Kikyu is. And when I do I'm going to do a water resistance test of Kikyu, and I've already done one for 54th Massachusetts, but I'll do it again. I'll do these two at the same time and see how they compare. On my copy paper, I wasn't really crazy about this ink in anything except for the Pilot Metropolitan. Everything else, like you can see, it spreads out just enough that it takes away some of the crispness from your writing. Just makes it look kind of bland, blah. And the Perkeo, I have trouble with the Perkeo with some inks. On poor quality paper, if it's a very absorbent paper, the ink just wants to get sucked out of the nib too quickly, so you go back and forth between blobs of ink and dry, blobs of ink and dry. And in my Leuchtturm, Noodler's inks, you have some that look really good on Leuchtturm paper, like Noodler's Black and X Feather looked good, and let me see, Kung De Ching was one of those absorbent ones that just wanted to spread. I didn't like it. And Lexington Gray, Rome Burning, L. Lawrence, and 54th Massachusetts are ones that just look grainy. And even Apache Sunset, to a degree, well, I take that back. Apache Sunset looked okay. It was kind of interesting. But 54th Massachusetts, out of all of these that looked grainy, it looked grainy and it kind of spread out and looked not good. So I didn't like this in the Leuchtturm paper. And it was weird because when I first wrote with, I thought, oh, that looks good. And then after it sat on the page for about a minute, it spread as it was sitting on the page, and just wasn't crazy about that. And on my Tomoe River paper, this is just flat, very little if any shading. It's pretty much flat and no sheen. This is just a work ink that I recommend using in the Metropolitan, because really any ink that wants to spread on the paper, that cursive medium, and it doesn't have to be a Metropolitan, just any narrow cursive medium or stub nib that writes kind of dry. I think the 78G broad nib is one of those. It's like a stub nib that will spread the ink out so that it doesn't have time to spread on the paper. We'll make it look its best. All right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.